Her tiny voice trembled. My hand hurt so much, but no one listened. Until a door slammed open and a millionaire father stormed in, his shout freezing the room. What he discovered that night would shatter his empire, test his heart, and uncover a truth no amount of wealth could silence. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The bell had already rung, but the classroom hummed with the soft rustle of paper and the whisper of pencil tips scratching at worksheets. Fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied, casting a thin glow over faded posters and crooked name tags. In the third row by the window, Clara Hale kept her head bowed. Her dark hair veiled her face, and beneath the desk she clutched her left hand with her right, pressing hard, as if pressure could quiet. Her knuckles were puffy and red. The back of her hand looked wrong, too big for her small wrist, a balloon tied too tight. She tried to curl her fingers, and felt a hot spark shoot up her arm. 2 desks over, a boy leaned toward another, his voice a hiss. She's being dramatic again. The other shrugged, eyes darting to Clara's hunched shoulders. A girl across the aisle bit her lip, uncomfortable. The whispers moved like a draft through the room, barely felt yet chilling. Miss Carver, young and good-hearted, scanned the rows, her gaze snagging on Clara's stiff posture. She started to speak, hesitated, and shuffled the worksheets instead. She had been told that Clara sometimes sought attention. She had also been told that her father was powerful beyond measure. Clara's breath stuttered. She peeked at her hand, at the skin stretched too tight. A throbbing pulse traveled from her wrist to her elbow, an invisible hammer tapping bone. She remembered last night's glass of ice, Gwent's water, pressed against the swelling, the way the cold made it ache and then numb, how she had wrapped it in a dish towel so no one would ask questions. The nanny hadn't looked up when Clara stood in the kitchen, small and silent. The clock had glowed past midnight. She had whispered to the refrigerator, humped like it was a friend. Hand hurt so much, she whispered now, so low that only the pencil in her other hand seemed to hear. The words came out like fog. Her eyes watered, but she blinked hard, pushing the tears back where they began. Crying made adults flinch or sigh. It made some of them angry. It made most of them turn away. She learned to hide the noise of pain before she learned long division. Miss Carver moved down the aisle, offering help that sounded like encouragement. Remember to line up your columns, everyone. When she reached Clara's desk, she paused. Her smile faltered. Clara, are you okay? The question arrived timidly, the end of the sentence climbing as if it were afraid to land. Clara nodded too fast, her pencil shook. Miss Carver crouched, lowering her voice. Do you need the nurse? The whisper fluttered between them, soft as tissue. Clara inhaled, gathered courage, and loosened her grip. The back of her hand had turned the shade of a storm bruise. 4 faint crescents, last night's accident with the cupboard door, had deepened into ugly marks. It hurts, she admitted. I think I banged it. I'm fine. The contradiction hung there, fragile and obvious. Miss Carver's eyes widened, and uncertainty fought with instinct on her face. Protocol said to call the office. Experience said to watch, to wait, to not overreact. A chair scraped. She's always fine, the boy muttered, not bothering to hide it. Laughter, small and tight, broke from another corner. Clara shrank, her shoulders folding in. She never told them that sometimes she woke with her mother's name on her tongue, that silence filled the house like dust. She never told them that the man whose picture was in the newspaper had the same last name as hers, even if he felt children could smell difference, the way dogs smelled rain. She kept everything tucked inside and let the ache sit with her like a secret pet. Ms. Carver stood and forced a smile that trembled. Let's take a little break, okay? Clara, would you come with me? The compliance line marched between fear and kindness. Clara nodded, but when she tried to rise, the room tilted. She steadied herself on the desk. A flash burst across her vision. The pain sharpened, bright as a siren. She breathed through it, counting to 5. Her voice came out, please. My hand hurts. Before Miss Carver could answer, a knock rattled the door. It swung open with a force that startled even the boldest whisperers. A man filled the frame in a dark coat and rain-slicked hair, shoulders squared and jaw set. His presence rearranged the room, scattering the students' attention like papers in wind. Richard Hale's eyes landed on Clara's pale face and then on the swollen hand cradled to her chest. The heat in his gaze changed the air. For a moment, nothing moved. "Where is the nurse? Why wasn't I called sooner?" His voice cracked the silence, deep and furious, but beneath the anger something raw trembled. Miss Carver stammered, color high in her cheeks. I was about to." She stopped, words stripping down to apology. She hadn't known whom to call. The emergency contact list was a mess of assistants and office numbers, names that answered with hold music and instruction. Clara's heart knocked against her ribs. She had not seen her father in days. When she did see him, he was a figure at a distance, a voice on the phone, a shadow that smelled faintly of cardamom and expensive cologne. He looked larger in person and somehow smaller where it counted. Now his face was open in a way she didn't recognize. It frightened her more than his anger. She pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. "Let me see," he said, softer, as he crossed to her desk. The students parted, their curiosity peeled back to awe. Richard knelt without ceremony, an expensive knee grazing the scuffed tile floor. "Clara?" Her name sounded careful in his mouth, as if he were learning how to hold it without breaking it. She held out her hand on instinct, then flinched when the air touched exposed bruises. He didn't touch it first, he just looked, the lines beside his eyes deepening. Who did this? The question flew out like a blade. Clara blinked, alarmed. She shook her head. "Nobody. I hid it by accident." The cupboard. The boy in the back snorted until Miss Carver's look cut him down. Richard exhaled slow and heavy, and when he spoke again, the thunder had softened to rain. "We're going to the hospital." He rose, turning to the teacher. "I'll email the principal. Her absence will be excused." Miss Carver nodded, a relief and a shame mingling in her eyes. She opened her mouth to say she was sorry she didn't press sooner, but Richard had already helped Clara into her coat. He moved with a startling gentleness, guiding her as if the air itself might bruise her if it pressed too hard. The class watched. Something complicated stirred in their faces. Guilt for the whispers, fascination with the father they had only heard about, the prickling awareness that the world was larger and more breakable than they thought. They stepped into the hallway, the door closing behind them with a hush. They reached the corridor, echoing with distant lockers and the squeak of a janitor's cart. Richard slowed his stride to match Clara's, yet the urgency pulsed off him like heat. "How long has it hurt?" he asked, voice too calm to be casual. Clara glanced down. "Since yesterday," she said, then corrected herself in a whisper. "Maybe the day before." The truth sat between them, heavy as a fallen book. At the office, the receptionist straightened when she recognized his name. Forms appeared, pens clattered, phones went still. Richard signed nothing, offering only a tight nod before guiding Clara out again. The sky had turned the color of tin. A light rain stitched the air. His car waited at the curb, black and glossy like a sealed promise. He opened the door and helped her in with both hands, careful as if lifting a bird with a broken wing. In the hush of the back seat, Clara leaned into the cool leather and watched the city slide by. Billboards glared, buses wheezed, horns spoke their impatient language, but inside the car was a capsule of breath and questions. Richard sat angled toward her, elbows on his knees, his tie loosened as if it choked. "You should have told someone," he said, not unkindly. "Miss Carver, the nurse." "Need." Her jaw tightened. "I did tell someone," she answered, and though her voice was small, it didn't shake. The sentence hit him like a hand pressed to a bruise. He looked away, throat working. The driver took a turn that made the skyline tilt. Clara pressed her palm to the window, leaving a small fog print that faded. She thought of the way the classroom had breathed when he walked in, how the whispers had vanished under the weight of his voice. She wondered if he took that weight everywhere, if rooms rearranged themselves to make space for him. She wondered what it would feel like if that gravity pulled her closer instead of pushing everything else away. At a red light, Richard reached into the console and pulled out a small packet of tissues. He opened one and wrapped it around her fingers, not tight, just enough to keep the air off the tenderness. "We'll get answers," he murmured. "We'll fix it," Clara nodded, because nodding was easier than explaining that sometimes adults said we and meant you, alone. She let him hold the corner of the tissue against her skin. The contact steadied her more than the words. When they reached the curb at the emergency entrance, the driver leapt out with an umbrella. Richard waved it away and lifted his jacket over Clara's head, ushering her beneath the awning. Automatic doors parted with a hiss. The waiting room was all bright lights and tired faces. posters promising care pinned above chairs that had seen too many midnights. A television talked to itself in the corner. Richard spoke to the desk in a voice that wore authority like a uniform. Names were typed, bands printed, clipboards slid across. He guided Clara to a seat and crouched again, so his eyes met hers. "I'm not leaving," he said. "Not this time." Her breath caught on the quiet promise embedded in those words. She didn't know how many times counted as "this time," only that they added up to more absences than she could count. She nodded again, and his shoulders loosened, as if that small motion granted him permission to breathe. A nurse called her name. They followed down a hallway that smelled faintly of soap and something metallic. In an exam room the color of wet paper, Clara sat on a crinkling sheet while the nurse asked questions and typed. "Any numbness? Can you move your fingers?" Clara tried. The movement tugged sparks across her knuckles. She winced. Richard flinched as if the pain traveled through some hidden wire into him. The doctor arrived with calm eyes and careful hands. He examined the swelling, the faint crescents, the way Clara guarded her wrist. "We'll do an X-ray to be safe," he said, gentle but firm. "Could be a sprain, could be a small fracture." He looked at Richard. "We'll know soon." Richard nodded, his thank you soft enough to surprise himself. In the imaging suite, the world changed to steel and whispers. Clara lay still while a machine hummed around her. Richard stood behind the line he was told not to cross, hands fisted and then unfisted at his sides. He watched her face, the courage pinned there like a ribbon, and wondered when she had learned to wear it without being taught. He wondered who had taught her to hide pain from adults who were supposed to carry it for her. Back in the room, they waited. Minutes stretched like rubber bands. Richard stared at a poster describing bones, tracing the picture of a hand with his eyes, memorizing the delicate architecture he had failed to notice when that hand had reached for him across dinner tables and phone calls he missed. Clara watched the door. Waiting rooms felt like unfair tests. How still can you be? How quiet can you make your... When the doctor returned, he smiled. "Good news and caution," he said. "No fracture, significant soft tissue injury, a moderate sprain with contusion. She needs rest, ice, compression, elevation, and follow-up. She's been pushing through pain for at least a day, maybe more." His eyes flicked to Richard with meaning that wasn't accusation so much as invitation. Relief and shame collided in Richard's chest. "We'll do everything you say," he replied. "Everything." He sounded like a man negotiating a merger with fate. The nurse wrapped Clara's hand in a soft bandage, the white gauze smoothing the angry swell into a neat parcel. When she finished, Clara flexed and found the pain dulled to a tolerable ache. Outside, the rain had eased to a mist. They stood under the low, gray sky, a father and a daughter who were still learning the shape of those words together. Richard cleared his throat. "Clara," he said, and the name hung there, delicate as china. "I should have been sooner. I should have been better." She looked up at him, the bandage bright against her coat sleeve. For a heartbeat, she didn't say anything. She exhaled slowly. Then she nodded once, solemn as a vow. "Can we go home?" she asked. He swallowed. The word meant different things in each of their minds. But he unlocked the car and held the door and decided, for once, to let her definition lead. The ride back from the hospital was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, pressing against the car windows and filling every corner. Clara leaned against the door, her bandaged hand resting on her lap like a fragile secret. She didn't speak, and Richard didn't know how to ask. He had faced hostile investors, ruthless negotiations, and boardrooms that wanted his empire for themselves. Yet nothing left him as unarmed as the sight of his daughter, looking away from him as if he were a stranger. He glanced at her from time to time, the soft profile of her face, the lashes lowered against her cheeks, the faint shadow of exhaustion under her eyes. All of it made him ache in a way he hadn't thought himself capable of anymore. She was his daughter, flesh of his flesh, yet he realized with a cold stab that he didn't know what she liked to eat for breakfast anymore. He didn't know the names of her friends or if she had any. He didn't even know what she dreamt about at night. At the mansion, the nanny was waiting, her arms folded and her face unreadable. "I didn't know it was this bad," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Clara slipped past her without a word, heading upstairs. Richard watched her small frame disappear up the sweeping staircase, every step feeling like a wall rising between them. The nanny turned to him. She didn't complain much, just wrapped it up herself. I thought it was a little bump. Kids do that. Her nonchalance burned him. You thought wrong, he snapped. His voice carried the sharpness of a blade, but beneath it was guilt that gnawed at his insides. He dismissed her with a curt nod and walked into his study, but the quiet there mocked him. He sat at his desk, the leather chair creaking beneath him. A folder of contracts waited, the kind of paperwork that once defined his worth. But his mind couldn't focus. Instead, he saw Clara's swollen hand, the way she had whispered, "It hurts," as though she were apologizing for feeling pain. He pressed his palms against his face, groaning into the hollow of his hands. The truth settled like lead. He hadn't been there. Not when she first fell, not when she first hurt, not when she cried quietly in her room and wrapped her own injury. He had been in meetings, traveling, signing deals that earned him headlines. He had told himself it was all for her future, for her security, for her name. But what future was he building if she was suffering in silence? The next morning, the doctor called with a follow-up. "She's healing, Mr. Hale, but you should know, judging by the state of the injury, she had it for at least 3 days before we treated it. She endured quite a lot." 3 days. The words pierced him. He remembered where he had been during those days, one night in Tokyo, the next in New York, then at a board meeting that stretched until dawn. His phone had buzzed with updates, none of them about Clara. He had left her world to others, delegating her childhood like another business. When he hung up, the room tilted with regret. He replayed the memory of her small voice saying, "I did tell someone," and realized she had been right. She had spoken, but not to him. She had learned that her father was not the one to tell. That afternoon, he tried to talk to her. He found her in her room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a puzzle half-finished before her. The bandage made her slow, but she didn't complain. She didn't look up when he entered. "Clara," he said gently, lowering himself to the floor across from her. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her hands paused. She pressed a piece into place and shrugged. "You weren't here." The words were simple, quiet, but they hit with the force of thunder. He opened his mouth to respond, but she continued. "You're never here." He wanted to deny it, to defend himself, to say he was working for her. But excuses rose like ash in his throat and disintegrated. He had no defense. She was right. He had been gone, and even when he was present, he wasn't really there. "Clara, his voice cracked, surprising him. He swallowed hard. "I should have been. I should have known." She looked at him then, her eyes wide and guarded. "You didn't know because you don't ask." Her honesty gutted him. He reached across the puzzle, his fingers brushing the edge of the cardboard pieces. "I want to do better," he whispered. "I don't want you to hurt alone again." Clara studied him, her small chest rising and falling. Then she turned back to the puzzle and pressed another piece in place. She didn't push him away, but she didn't embrace him either. It was a middle ground, fragile but real. He accepted it as the only beginning he was worthy of. That night, lying awake in the master bedroom that felt too large, Richard thought of Clara's mother. Grace had been the heart he could never match. Warm, intuitive, endlessly patient, she had softened his sharp edges, made him laugh when the world pressed too hard. When she died, something in him calcified. He had thought he was protecting himself from shattering, but in truth, he had only built walls that he'd covered grief with numbers, pain with power, and in the process, he had abandoned his daughter without ever leaving the house. Now, with Clara's injury as a mirror, he saw himself for what he was, not a protector, not a present father, but a man who had hidden from the very love he had once sworn to honor. The following days blurred into a test he had never prepared for. Meetings went unattended, calls piled up, but he silenced his phone. Instead, Richard lingered near Clara's world. He sat with her at breakfast, though conversation was minimal. He walked her to school, ignoring the surprised looks from teachers unused to his presence. He tried, awkwardly, to braid her hair one morning, and though it ended in a tangled mess, she laughed. That laugh haunted him, not with pain, but with longing. He realized he would do anything to hear it again. Still, guilt gnawed at him. Every time she winced adjusting her bandage, He remembered the nights he had been gone. Every time she asked the nanny for help instead of him, he remembered her words. "You weren't here." It was a wound that bandages couldn't fix, one that demanded time and proof. One evening, he found himself standing in the doorway of Clara's room, watching her sleep. Her doll rested beside her, its button eye loose. The puzzle lay unfinished at her bedside. He thought of how small she looked in the enormous bed, how much she carried without complaint. He thought of the whispered plea in class, "My hand hurts so much." He wondered how many other quiet cries he had missed. In that stillness, memories unfurled. Clara, as a baby, wrapped in Grace's arms, her tiny hand gripping his finger with astonishing strength. Grace whispering, "She needs you." He had promised then, with every conviction he owned, that he would never fail them. Yet here he was, 7 years later, staring at evidence of his. Tears burned his eyes, uninvited but unstoppable. He pressed his fist against his mouth, muffling the sound. He realized the empire he had built meant nothing if it left his daughter to whisper her pain in shadows. The next morning, he made a decision. He cleared his schedule, canceled a trip overseas, and told his board he would be unavailable indefinitely. They protested, investors fretted, but for once, he didn't care. "My daughter comes first," he said flatly, ending the discussion. The boardroom could wait. Contracts could wait. For years, he had lived as though time was a currency he could control. But Clara's bandaged hand proved otherwise. Time had slipped, stolen by absence, and now he intended to claim it back, not for power, not for wealth, but for her. At dinner that evening, he tried again. "Clara, do you remember the park we used to go to with your mother?" he asked softly. She looked up from her plate, eyes cautious. "The one with the swings?" She nodded, a flicker of memory sparking. "Would you like to go again this weekend?" There was a pause, then a small smile broke through. "Yes," she whispered. It was not forgiveness, it was not healing, but it was a step toward both. That night, Richard sat at his desk and pulled out an old photo album. Dust clung to the cover, a testament to years neglected. He flipped through pages of a younger version of himself, of Grace's radiant smile, of Clara as a toddler with cake smeared across her cheeks. His chest tightened. He had been given love once, pure and abundant, and he had squandered it in the name of survival. Now, he vowed he would not squander the chance to reclaim it. For the first time in years, Richard Hale didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a father learning to begin again. The days after Clara's hospital visit unraveled truths Richard wished he could ignore. But reality had sharp edges, and each day seemed to cut deeper into his chest. The doctors had reassured him her hand would heal, but what lingered behind the injury, the silence, the fear, the way Clara had carried pain without a word, gnawed at him relentlessly. Richard ordered an internal review of every detail surrounding his daughter's care. For years, he had delegated Clara's day-to-day life to others, trusting professionals and assuming money guaranteed loyalty. Now he wanted answers. His assistant gathered reports, school records, nanny logs, and surveillance footage from the house. One morning, as Clara rested upstairs, Richard sat in his study with a manila folder on the desk. The head of household staff cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, we looked into Miss Grayson's conduct. The staff say Clara tried to tell her about her hand several times. She brushed it off, said it was nothing, that the girl was only seeking attention." The words set Richard's blood boiling. His jaw tightened until it hurt, and his hand slammed against the desk, rattling a glass of water. "Attention, Skate?" His voice thundered, sharp and dangerous. "My daughter was injured, in pain, and she dared to call it attention." The staff member flinched but nodded. It seems Clara wrapped the hand herself. Miss Grayson only applied more pressure by scolding her when she complained. She told the others not to indulge Clara's. Richard rose so abruptly his chair screeched back against the marble floor. He stormed out, fury vibrating in every step. His footsteps echoed down the hallway until he reached the nanny's quarters. The door opened to reveal Miss Grayson herself, a middle-aged woman with a crisp uniform and a pinched face that had long pretended to hold authority. She froze when she saw him, color draining from her cheeks. "Mr. Hale," she stammered, her voice suddenly fragile. "I was just about to check on Clara." "Save your excuses," Richard cut her off, his voice icy, carrying the kind of power that had silenced boardrooms and crushed rivals. You ignored her. My daughter begged for help, and you dismissed her as if her pain were an inconvenience. You dared to belittle her suffering. She flinched under the weight of his glare. I didn't think it was serious. Children exaggerate. Richard stepped closer, fury radiating from him. Exaggerate? His words hit like hammer blows. You had one job, to protect her. And instead, you taught her silence. You failed her. You failed me. You are finished here. Get out of my house before I forget every ounce of restraint I have left. Miss Grayson's eyes filled with tears, but he had no patience for them. She fumbled for her bag, her hands shaking. Within minutes, security escorted her out, her protests drowned beneath Richard's simmering rage. The echo of his own voice lingered long after she was gone. He should have felt relief, even vindication, but instead, a hollow ache spread in his chest. He had roared like a storm, yet the storm hadn't protected Clara. It had terrified her. When he turned back toward the staircase, he froze. At the landing stood Clara, small and fragile, her bandaged hand cradled against her chest, her wide eyes brimmed with fear, not of Miss Grayson, but of him. "Barry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't shout." The words shattered him more completely than any argument could have. In her voice was not only the tremor of the present moment, but the weight of a childhood where anger had loomed like thunderclouds. She had grown accustomed to his sharp tone, his cold commands, his bursts of frustration at the world. And she had learned to shrink before them. Richard's knees buckled. For the first time he sank to the ground, not in defeat but in recognition. Slowly he lowered himself until he knelt before his daughter at the foot of the stairs. His hands trembled as he reached for hers. "Clara," he whispered, voice stripped of power, bare and human. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at myself, at the people I trusted who failed you. But I swear to you, never again will I let you hurt alone." Her lip trembled, and she looked at him with cautious eyes, searching for truth in his words. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead lightly to the back of her uninjured hand. "I'm here now," he whispered again, as though the words could anchor themselves into her heart. Clara's small body softened, a sigh escaping her lips. She didn't throw her arms around him, not yet, but she didn't flinch away. She allowed him to kneel, to hold her hand, to bear the weight of his guilt in silence. For Richard, it was enough to know he had finally begun to kneel where he had once only towered. The following day, Richard dismissed half of the household staff who had enabled Miss Grayson's negligence. His empire had taught him to reward loyalty and punish betrayal, and nothing felt more like betrayal than silence in the face of Clara's pain. Yet the more he fired, the more he realized the truth. Power alone couldn't mend what had already broken. He spent the morning by Clara's hospital bed instead of in his office. For years, he had measured his life in meetings and deals. Now he counted it in the rhythm of her breathing, the twitch of her fingers, the quiet murmurs when she dreamed. When Clara stirred, he straightened. "Do you want water? Or maybe—" Her eyes opened slowly. "You don't have to stay," she whispered. The words cut deep. "I do," he said firmly, his throat thick. "I want to—" She studied him for a moment before looking away. "You never did before." The honesty was a knife. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're right, I didn't. I thought providing money and safety was enough, but I see now it wasn't. I should have been here all along. And I'm sorry." Absolutely. Her lips pressed together as if she wanted to believe him but didn't know how. He reached for her hand gently, careful of the bandage. "I can't change the past, Clara, but I can promise you this. From today on, you will never face your pain alone. I will be here, whether it's a hurt hand, a bad dream, or just a long day. I will be here." Her gaze softened, and for the first time in months, she let her small fingers curl around his. The gesture was hesitant, fragile, but it lit a flame of hope in him. That evening, Richard made another vow. Standing in the empty mansion, where his voice once filled the air with commands and arguments, he whispered into the silence. "No more shouting, no more walls. She will know, louder than my anger ever was. The mansion seemed to echo his promise, and for the first time in years, Richard Hale felt the weight of transformation pressing against his chest. The hospital lights flickered faintly in the evening glow, long shadows stretching across the polished floor. Richard sat in the stiff bare chair beside Clara's bed, his eyes fixed on her small, fragile hand resting atop the blanket. It was wrapped carefully in fresh bandages, yet the sight of it twisted his stomach with guilt. He had thought money and security were enough. Now he realized how little he had given compared to what she truly needed. Clara shifted in her sleep, her lips moving as though she were whispering to someone. Richard leaned forward, straining to hear, but the words were too soft, lost in the hum of the hospital machines. He wondered if she was calling for her mother, the woman who had once filled their home with warmth and laughter, before death had left both of them hollow. The silence pressed against him, and with it came memories he had long buried. Richard was no stranger to hospitals, not because of illness, but because of the countless times his father had dragged him into places where pain and fear were sharpened into lessons. Weakness is failure, his father's voice echoed in his mind, deep and merciless. And failure will never bear my name. He remembered being Clara's age, maybe even younger, standing in a vast study where his father loomed over him like a mountain. The man's presence filled every corner of the room, his tailored suits sharp, his voice sharp. Richard remembered the sting of humiliation more than the sting of punishment. His father would look at him with cold, assessing eyes, as though Richard were nothing more than an investment that might collapse at any moment. He had sworn then, sworn on his mother's tears and his own clenched fists, that he would never repeat that cycle. He would never become the man who silenced a child with anger or froze them with fear. Yet as he sat beside Clara, he realized with horror that he had already walked the same path. She had flinched from him, she had begged him not to shout. The echo of her small, trembling voice haunted him. "Please don't shout, Daddy." The words pressed into his ribs like glass. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes, and for a moment he was no longer a man of empires and fortunes. He was a boy again, shrinking beneath a father's glare, wishing for kindness that never came. "Daddy?" His eyes snapped open. Clara was awake, her big brown eyes searching his face with a mix of weariness and quiet courage. He sat up straighter. "I'm here," he said softly, the words almost a plea. Her lips trembled. "Do you love me, Daddy?" The question pierced him like a blade. It was so simple, so pure, and yet it carried the weight of years he had spent behind walls of work and silence. He opened his mouth to answer, but the words caught in his throat. Love, of course he loved her, but had he shown it? Had she ever felt it? His silence stretched on too long. Clara's gaze faltered, her eyes filling with unshed tears. She turned her face to the wall, her small shoulders curling inward. Richard's chest caved in. That single moment, the hesitation, the pause, the deeper than every raised voice, every slammed door, every moment of absence. His silence had told her more than his shouting ever could, that she wasn't sure if she was loved. He reached out desperately, brushing his hand against her hair. "Clara," he whispered hoarsely. His voice cracked. He swallowed hard, forcing the truth out through a throat tight with grief. "I love you, more than I have words for, more than I ever thought I could, and I'm sorry if I didn't show you." "I'm sorry." But Clara didn't respond. She had already closed her eyes, retreating into herself, a wall built by years of neglect. His confession had come too late to soothe the wound of his hesitation. Richard leaned back in the chair, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to cry. Not as a CEO, not as a man hardened by loss, but as a father who had failed. And in that moment, the ghosts of his past loomed larger than ever. His father's voice echoed in his head. Weakness is failure. But this time, Richard recognized the truth. His weakness wasn't in showing love, it was in hiding it. He bowed his head beside his daughter's bed and whispered into the quiet, "I will not be him. I will not let you grow up thinking love is a question." The following morning, Richard walked through the sterile corridors of the hospital, his mind a storm of regret and resolve. Everywhere he turned, he saw fragments of himself in Clara. The silence, the hesitation to speak, the way her shoulders tensed when someone raised their voice. She was carrying the shadows of his upbringing, and it was tearing her spirit apart. He remembered nights as a boy when he had crept into bed clutching a toy car, just as Clara now clung to her stuffed bear. He had whispered into the dark, asking the question no one ever answered, "Do you love me, Daddy?" The silence that always followed had been worse than any punishment. Now his daughter had asked him the same question, and he had faltered. When he returned to Clara's room, she was awake, staring at the sunlight streaming through the blinds. Her expression was distant, guarded, like a soldier bracing for battle. Richard approached cautiously, his voice low. "Good morning, sweetheart." She didn't answer, she only hugged the stuffed bear tighter. Richard sat down, his heart breaking at her silence. "Clara, about last night?" His voice wavered. "I should have answered you right away. I should never have let you wonder. I love you. That's the truth I should have said without hesitation." Her eyes flicked toward him, uncertain. "You didn't say it right away." The sting of her words was sharper than any business rival's strike. He nodded slowly. "You're right, and I can't take that back. But I can show you now. I can prove it every day, if you'll let me." She studied him quietly, her young face far too wise for her years. "How?" she asked softly. The question left him breathless. How does one prove love to a child they've neglected? Not with gifts, not with money, not with promises too big to keep. Richard thought of his father again, of all the lessons learned in cruelty, and realized the answer was the opposite of everything he had been taught. "By being here," he said finally. "By listening, by never letting you doubt it again." Clara blinked, her lips pressing together. For the first time, a tear slipped down her cheek. Richard reached out gently, wiping it away with his thumb. He whispered, "I'm not going to let you wonder anymore." The room fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy with absence. It was fragile, like a bridge being built one plank at a time. Richard sat by her side, holding her hand, and for the first time in years, he felt the faintest warmth of hope stir inside him. Later that night, as Clara drifted into sleep, Richard stood by the window of her hospital room, staring out at the city lights. He saw his reflection in the glass, not the powerful CEO the world admired, but a man haunted by ghosts. His father's shadow still clung to him, whispering old lies about strength and love. But now he had a choice. He could continue the cycle, or he could break it. He turned back to Clara, his heart aching at her small, fragile form in the bed, and he whispered a vow into the dark. A vow no boardroom could ever understand. "I will not fail you again. You will never ask me if I love you and hear silence. You will know, always." The day Clara was discharged from the hospital should have been a relief, a chance to bring her home and leave behind the sterile corridors and restless nights. Richard thought so too, until the moment his driver pulled up in front of their mansion and a cluster of flashing cameras burst from the shadows like a swarm of bees. "Millionaire father neglects daughter's health," one headline screamed from a reporter's tablet. Another shouted, "Richard Hale, too busy for his own child?" The barrage of questions that followed pierced the air. "Mr. Hale, is it true your daughter hid her pain for days because she was afraid of you? Mr. Hale, are you unfit to raise Clara on your own?" The words were knives, each one cutting deeper into the fragile bridge Richard had only just begun to build with his daughter. Clara, seated beside him in the back seat, curled against the leather seat and buried her face in her stuffed bear. Her small hand trembled. "Drive," Richard barked, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The car lurched forward, speeding past the chaos. But the storm didn't stop at the gates. By evening, every media outlet was replaying footage of Clara being carried out of the hospital. Inside the mansion, the tension deepened. Richard's board of directors convened an emergency meeting, their polished voices clipped with impatience. "Scandal threatens the Hale name," one board member warned over the conference call. "Investors are questioning your leadership." "You cannot appear weak," another added sharply. "If you can't even manage your household, how can you manage an empire?" Richard sat in his office, the glow of the monitor painting his face in cold light. He rubbed his temples, the weight of 1,000 expectations pressing down on him. For years, the empire had been his shield, the fortress he built to keep vulnerability out. But now, the very walls were caving in. One suggestion repeated itself like a drumbeat. Send Clara to live with relatives until this dies down, for her own good. The words clawed at him. For her own good. That was what his father had always said before banishing Richard to boarding schools, before turning love into a currency that could never be earned. He remembered standing at windows, watching cars drive away, wondering why, for your own good, always felt like abandonment. And yet, the thought crept in. Clara deserved stability, didn't she? Maybe she would be safer, far from the storm of flashing cameras and ruthless headlines. Maybe she wouldn't have to carry the weight of his mistakes. That night, as the storm outside rattled against the mansion windows, Richard sat in the study, staring at Clara's medical papers and a folder of press clippings spread across his desk. His hand hovered over the phone, ready to make the call to his sister in Boston. She would take Clara in a heartbeat. The door creaked open, softly. Clara stood there, her small frame wrapped in a blanket, her stuffed bear clutched tightly. Her eyes were red, as though she had been crying. "Daddy?" she asked quietly. Richard froze, the phone still in his hand. "Heard you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're going to send me away." His chest collapsed. "Clara, no, it's not." Her lower lip quivered. "It's because I'm a problem. I make trouble for you. The people on TV said so. You don't have time for me." "Clara, that's not true," Richard said desperately, standing to go to her, but she stepped back, her eyes filled with hurt. "Don't want to be a burden," she said softly. And before he could reach her, she turned and ran down the hall, her small footsteps echoing against the marble floor. "Clara!" Richard shouted, his heart pounding. He bolted after her, but by the time he reached the grand entryway, the front door slammed shut against the storm outside. Panic surged through him, a cold fire racing through his veins. He tore the door open, calling her name into the night. Rain lashed against his face, wind whipping his coat. The grounds were vast, the city beyond even larger, and his little girl was, out there, alone. For the first time in his life, Richard Hale felt truly powerless. The storm raged as Richard sprinted into the night, his shouts swallowed by thunder. He searched the grounds first, racing past the hedges, the garden, the long driveway leading to the gates. No sign of her. His heart pounded with a terror he hadn't felt since the night he lost his wife, a grief he thought he would never relive. He ordered security to comb the estate, his voice breaking with urgency. "Find her, now!" But deep down, he knew Clara would not hide where guards could easily spot her. She had run further, beyond the gates, away from the mansion she now believed had no room for her. Richard grabbed his car keys and sped into the city, his mind a blur of images. Clara's swollen hand, her whispered question, "Do you love me, Daddy?" and the look on her face when she thought she wasn't wanted. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened. Rain blurred the windshield as he scanned the streets, calling her name at every red light. "Clara!" His voice cracked, raw and desperate. He drove past the school where she had sat hiding her pain, past the hospital that still smelled of antiseptic and regret, past the small bakery where he once promised her they would stop but never did. He searched everywhere a lonely child might go, and yet every corner turned up empty. Finally, at a quiet intersection, he pulled over, his chest heaving with dread. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from security. No sign of her on the grounds. Richard slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his breath ragged. For all his millions, for all his power, he couldn't protect the one person who needed him most. And then, through the pounding rain, he spotted something. A small figure huddled beneath the awning of a closed bookstore, her blanket soaked, her stuffed bear clutched tightly against her chest. Clara. Richard's heart lurched. He leapt from the car, the rain soaking through his clothes in seconds. He ran to her, kneeling in the puddles at her feet. "Clara." His voice broke. "Don't ever run from me again." She looked up, her eyes swollen from crying. "I thought you didn't want me." The words shattered him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly he was afraid she might break. "No," he whispered fiercely, his tears mingling with the rain. I was wrong. I was weak. But I will never let you go. Do you hear me? You are not a burden. You are my daughter. My life." Clara sobbed into his chest, her small arms finally clutching him back. For the first time, she didn't shrink from his embrace. She clung to it. Richard buried his face in her wet hair, vowing silently that nothing, not the tabloids, not the board, not the weight of an empire, would ever come before her again. When he carried her back to the car, she rested her head against his shoulder, whispering through hiccups, "I just wanted you to love me." His voice broke as he answered, "I do, Clara. I always have, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." As he strapped her safely into the back seat, Richard realized something monumental had shifted. The empire he had built suddenly felt small compared to the fragile girl beside him. He no longer feared the headlines, the board, or the loss of reputation. The only thing he feared was losing Clara's trust again. And as the car pulled away from the storm-soaked streets, Richard knew this was his breaking point. Not into ruin, but into redemption. It started with a shaky video posted by a stranger. A woman walking her dog through the city park one damp morning had paused at the sight of a little girl sitting alone on a bench, her blanket draped around her shoulders. A stuffed bear propped beside her. She held a stray puppy close, whispering to it as though it were her only friend. The stranger had lifted her phone and recorded without thinking. Later, she admitted she had almost deleted it until she heard the child's words. "Hand still hurts," Clara whispered to the puppy, her voice soft and fragile. "But Daddy doesn't want me. He wants his work. I think maybe if I was better, he would love me more." The video was less than a minute long, but by evening, it had been watched over 1 million times. By midnight, 10 million. And by dawn, the entire world knew the name Clara Hale. Headlines blazed across every outlet. "Millionaire's daughter claims, Daddy doesn't want me." Talk shows played the clip on repeat. Commentators condemned Richard, their voices heavy with judgment. "This isn't about wealth or power," one anchor said gravely. "This is about a child begging for love." For the first time in his career, Richard Hale was not being criticized for a failed merger or a controversial acquisition. This was personal. His empire was untouched, but his heart, his name as a father, was under fire. Inside the mansion, Richard watched the video on his office screen, his hands trembling. The sight of Clara on that bench, clutching that stray puppy with such desperate tenderness, pierced him deeper than any headline ever could. Her words replayed over and over. "Daddy doesn't want me." He pressed his fists against his eyes, but the tears came anyway. For decades, he had armored himself against weakness, but this was different. This was his daughter, his blood, declaring to the world that he had failed her. Clara sat quietly in the living room as the storm unfolded, unaware of the magnitude. She had seen the cameras on TV, but didn't know the fury they carried. All she knew was that Daddy had been quiet more than usual, and that silence frightened her more than shouting. Richard's board called him within hours, their voices sharp and businesslike. "This is a PR nightmare. Your credibility is gone. You must release a statement immediately. Deny what she said. Blame the nanny if you must." But Richard slammed the laptop shut before they could finish. For once, he didn't care about spin or stock prices. The empire could burn. None of it mattered if Clara believed she was unwanted. That night, Richard sat outside Clara's room, listening to her soft breathing through the crack in the door. His heart ached with a truth he had buried for years. He didn't know how to love without fear of failing. He had built walls so high that even his own daughter couldn't climb them. The next morning, the mansion gates were flooded with reporters. Security advised him to avoid them, to wait until the story lost momentum. But Richard knew waiting was cowardice. The world could see his weakness, yes, but perhaps it was time for the world to see his heart. At noon, he called a press conference. The hall was packed with journalists, cameras flashing like lightning, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Richard stood at the podium, his usual armor of confidence stripped away. He looked exhausted, his suit slightly wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed. The murmurs quieted as he began. "I have stood before you many times to speak about business. Profit, deals, power. His voice cracked on the last word. But today is not about business. It is about failure, mine. The room stilled. I saw the video, he continued, his voice breaking. That little girl on the bench is my daughter, Clara. She is not just a headline. She is not just a child of a millionaire. She is my world. And yet, she believes I don't want her. His chest heaved. He gripped the podium as if it were the only thing holding him up. Is the greatest failure of my life. Not the losses in business, not the mistakes of my past, but letting my daughter feel unwanted, letting her think she was not enough. Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one expected Richard Hale, the man known for his ruthless efficiency, his unshakable image, to tremble before them. She is not my weakness, he said, his voice firming with conviction. She is my strength, my reason, my future, and I will spend every day proving to her that she is loved, wanted, and cherished. No empire, no fortune will ever come before her again. Silence hung heavy. Then, slowly, one reporter lowered her pen. Another lowered his camera. The room was not filled with the usual cynical chatter. It was filled with something else: sympathy. For the first time, Richard had not hidden behind numbers. He had not fought with polished words. He had broken down, and in doing so, he had given the world something it had never seen. Richard Hale, not the businessman, but the father. And outside the glare of the cameras, in the quiet of her room, Clara watched the broadcast on the small TV. Her stuffed bear tucked under her arm, she heard her father's words and whispered softly, "He wants me." The impact of Richard's confession rippled far beyond the press hall. By evening, social media was ablaze with a new headline: "Millionaire father breaks down. She is my world." Clips of his trembling voice, his tear-stained eyes spread across platforms. Hashtags flipped from scorn to sympathy. Richard, the father, trended worldwide, alongside Clara. People who had condemned him hours earlier now praised his courage. For once, Richard's wealth was not the focus. It was his humanity. But inside the mansion, the work was not finished. Public opinion could shift like sand. What mattered most was the small girl upstairs, who needed more than words. That night, Richard climbed the staircase slowly, his heart pounding. He paused outside Clara's door, unsure if she would even let him in. When he pushed it open, he found her sitting cross-legged on her bed, her bear in her lap, eyes wide and solemn. "Patty," she whispered. Richard sat beside her, his hands trembling. "Clara, I saw the video. I heard what you said." She looked down, ashamed. "I didn't know anyone was listening." "What the matter?" Richard said, his voice thick. "What matters is, I should have been listening all along." Her small fingers fidgeted with the bear's ear. Do you really want me?" The question gutted him. He pulled her into his arms, his tears dampening her hair. "More than anything in this world, you are my daughter, my heart. I am sorry I ever made you doubt that." Clara leaned into him, silent for a long time. Then she whispered, "Can you promise?" Richard held her tighter. "Yes, I promise. I will never let you feel unwanted again." The days that followed were filled with both challenges and healing. The tabloids shifted tone, running headlines like, "From CEO to Father, Richard Hale's Redemption." Public sympathy grew, but so did scrutiny. Every move he made was analyzed. Yet, for Richard, the world outside mattered less than the world inside. He began leaving the office earlier, sitting with Clara at dinner, reading her bedtime stories. At first, the words felt foreign on his tongue, but soon they became the anchor of his nights. Clara, slowly, began to blossom. Her laughter returned, soft at first, then brighter, filling the halls of the mansion that had long been cold. Still, there were moments of hesitation. At school, she heard whispers from other children, repeating what their parents had read online. Her daddy doesn't love her. Clara flinched, but this time she had Richard waiting outside the school gates, his presence steady, his hand warm around hers. Each small act was a brick in the bridge Richard was rebuilding. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Richard stood on the balcony with Clara in his arms. The lights of the skyline shimmered, but for the first time, he didn't see profit or power. He saw legacy, not built in boardrooms, but in the trust of the child who now leaned her head against his chest without fear. "You know what I realized, Clara?" he murmured. She asked softly. "Being your father is not my weakness," he kissed her hair. "It's the greatest strength I've ever known." Clara smiled, her small hand curling into his, and in that moment, Richard knew the truth of his words. The world could rise or fall, fortunes could grow or crumble, but the only empire worth building was the one he was building now, brick by fragile brick, with the little girl who had once whispered to a stray dog in the park. The park was nearly deserted when Richard arrived, rain pouring in relentless sheets that blurred the glow of street lamps into streaks of gold. He had searched for hours, frantic, driven by a fear that had hollowed his chest. Then he saw her, Clara, small and fragile, sitting on the same weathered bench from the video that had shaken the world. Her hair clung to her face, soaked through, and her stuffed bear sat drenched on her lap. She looked like a child lost in a storm, yet her stillness was almost too much to bear. For a moment, Richard froze, the sight of her cutting deeper than any headline ever could. Slowly, he stepped forward, his shoes splashing in puddles. Clara turned her head at the sound, her eyes wide, wary. She didn't run to him, not this time. That hesitation was his punishment, the price of every silence, every absence. "Clara," he whispered, his voice trembling, but the rain almost swallowed it whole. He came closer, then, without hesitation, he dropped to his knees in the mud before her. His expensive suit clung to him, ruined, but he didn't care. For the first time in his life, Richard Hale wasn't the untouchable millionaire. He was just a father, broken and desperate. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have been here. I should have listened when you said your hand hurt. I should have been the one to hold you when you were scared. And instead, I left you feeling alone." Clara clutched her bear tighter, her lips trembling. The rain mingled with the tears she tried to hide. "I thought money could fix everything," Richard continued, pressing his hand to his chest. "I built an empire, but I forgot the only empire that matters. Us. You, my little girl." His voice cracked, raw. "Your words, 'my hand hurts,' echoed louder than all my millions. Louder than every boardroom, every deal. They shattered me, Clara, because I realized I didn't hear you until the world did." She sniffled, her eyes shimmering. "I didn't want the world, Daddy," she whispered. Her voice was small, but it cut straight through him. "I just wanted you." Words undid him. He bowed his head, his tears falling freely. "And you should have had me. From the very beginning." He reached for her hand, hesitated, then whispered, "Please, let me try again. Not as the man in the headlines, not as the businessman, just as your father." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain pelting against the pavement. Clara stared at him, her face pale, her lips quivering. She had seen his anger, his distance, his absence. Could she believe this man on his knees, drenched and trembling? Her small hand lifted, slowly, hesitantly, until her fingers brushed his. "Will you stay? Really stay?" Richard covered her hand with both of his, gripping it like a lifeline. "Forever. I'll never walk away again. Not from you." A sob escaped her, and she leaned forward. He caught her, wrapping his arms around her tiny frame, holding her as though she might vanish. In the pouring rain, father and daughter clung to each other, both broken, both healing. For the first time in years, Richard felt something shift inside him. Not the cold satisfaction of victory, but the warmth of love rediscovered. As they stayed there, drenched but together, the world outside ceased to matter. The cameras, the critics, the empire, all of it faded. Only Clara's heartbeat against his chest mattered. Only her whispered plea, "I just wanted you." "And for once," Richard whispered back, "and now you have me." The rain slowed to a drizzle, but Richard did not let go. He carried Clara in his arms, shielding her with his coat, walking back toward the car that had been waiting. For once, he ignored the driver's shocked expression, ignored the mud clinging to his knees. He placed Clara gently inside, tucking her bear into her arms, and sat beside her instead of in the front. She leaned against him, silent, her eyelids heavy. He brushed damp hair from her face, whispering, "You don't ever have to be alone again. Not while I'm breathing." When they reached the mansion, Richard didn't summon the staff. He carried Clara inside himself, past the gilded halls that once seemed so empty. Upstairs, he placed her carefully on the bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She stirred, her eyes half opening. "Daddy," she whispered. "Don't be gone when I wake up." The words cut deep, a reminder of every night he had left her to the care of others. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I'll be right here, always." She drifted to sleep, and for the first time, Richard pulled a chair to her bedside and sat through the night. He didn't check his phone, he didn't review contracts, he simply watched his daughter breathe. Every rise and fall of her chest, a vow, he silently repeated, "Never again." The next morning, the world buzzed with headlines about his press conference, his breakdown, his confession, but Richard didn't read them. He sat at the breakfast table with Clara, pouring her orange juice himself. She blinked in surprise, then smiled softly, a smile that told him she was beginning to believe. When he later faced his board, their disapproval was sharp. "You've made yourself vulnerable," one of them scolded. "You've damaged the company's reputation. We cannot afford—" Richard stood, his voice steady in a way it had never been before. "I cannot afford to lose my daughter. If that costs me the company, so be it. I will not let wealth cost me her love again." There was silence. No one dared to challenge him further. Viva's back. That evening, Richard took Clara back to the park, not to relive the pain, but to reclaim it. They stood together by the bench where she had once whispered to a stray dog. He knelt beside her, pointing, "This place doesn't get to hold your sadness anymore. From today, it's where we began again." Clara slipped her hand into his. "Can we bring flowers?" Richard said softly, his throat tight. "We'll bring flowers." As they left, Clara's steps were lighter, and Richard's heart was fuller. The man who had once measured his worth in billions now measured it in smiles, in whispered promises, in the tiny hand that trusted his once more. That night, as Clara slept, Richard stood at her door, whispering to the quiet house, "I will change. For her, for us, for the legacy that isn't money, but love." And for the first time in his life, he believed it. 1 year later, the Cole estate no longer echoed with silence. Where once the marble halls had felt like a mausoleum of Ethan's wealth, they now thrummed with warmth. Laughter spilled from the kitchen, music drifting from the study, the pitter-patter of small footsteps dancing across. Ethan Cole, the man who once buried himself in balance sheets and quarterly gains, now found himself measuring life by different numbers. Mia's giggles, Isabella's soft smiles, the steady rhythm of family meals shared around a long wooden table that no longer felt empty. The journey had not been perfect. There had been clashes, over trust, over fears, over the wounds of the past that could not be erased with vows or rings. But every fight had ended with something Ethan once thought impossible: compromise. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control outcomes. He was learning to belong. He and Isabella were married now, though the wedding had been nothing like society expected from a CEO. No sprawling ballroom, no champagne towers. Instead, it had been held in the very shelter where Ethan had first knelt in the rain, begging her forgiveness. Volunteers who had once watched silently now clapped as Isabella walked down the aisle with Mia as her flower girl. The vows were simple, but they carried more weight than any contract Ethan had ever signed. "To save," Ethan had whispered, holding Isabella's trembling hands. "But to belong." And Isabella, her voice breaking, had answered, "Not to be rescued, but to be loved." That promise had carried them into the new life they were now building together. The Cole mansion had been transformed. A portion of its unused wings had been repurposed into transitional apartments for families leaving homelessness. Isabella's idea. She had insisted that they couldn't just throw money at shelters across the city while living in empty luxury. If they had space, it had to be used. Ethan resisted at first. His pride bristled at the thought of strangers under his roof. But Isabella's conviction never wavered. Eventually, he relented, and when he saw children laughing in rooms that once gathered dust, something in him shifted permanently. It was from that vision that the Homeward Foundation was born. Together, Ethan and Isabella launched it with a mission: to provide housing, education, and counseling for homeless children and their families. Ethan provided the funding, but Isabella led the heart. She refused to let it become a faceless charity. Every program had names and stories attached, every decision filtered through the lens of dignity. And Mia, the little girl once found shivering at a bus stop, became their unexpected ambassador. Her smile graced the foundation's brochures, not as a symbol of pity, but of possibility. On this particular afternoon, the foundation was hosting its first major event, a community fair at a renovated downtown park, open not to donors in tuxedos, but to the very families they sought to serve. Food stalls lined the walkways, children played on newly built swings, and laughter blended with the live music drifting from a local bandstand. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, his arm loosely draped around Isabella's waist as he watched Mia dart between booths, her hair flying, her doll tucked safely in her arm despite its ragged edges. For all his billions, nothing he owned compared to the sight of her joy. Elodie leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice quiet beneath the noise. "You've changed more than this mansion, Ethan. You've changed yourself." He swallowed hard, his gaze locked on Mia's skipping figure. "No," he whispered. "You both changed me. I only followed where you led." It was then that a boy, no older than Mia, approached her. His clothes were worn, his eyes carrying the weight of hunger and nights spent on sidewalks. But there was curiosity in his voice as he asked softly, "Do you still remember the bus stop?" The question froze time. For a moment, Ethan's chest ached, remembering the cold night he had nearly walked away forever. But Mia didn't flinch. She smiled, her small hand slipping into Ethan's on one side and Isabella's on the other. "Remember," she said, her voice bright but steady, "but I don't live there anymore." Tears burned Ethan's eyes before he could stop them. The little girl who once whispered dreams to a ragged doll was now strong enough to tell her story aloud. He bent his head, pressing a kiss against her hair, his voice breaking as he whispered words he had rehearsed in his heart 1,000 times. He said, so only they could hear. "This is the legacy I want to leave behind. Not the company, not the wealth, just this. Us." Isabella's hand tightened around his. She knew, better than anyone, how far he had come, from the cold CEO who once believed money was the only shield, to the man now standing with tears in his eyes at a community fair, unashamed of love. And for the first time, Ethan believed it too. The fair stretched into evening, lanterns glowing as families gathered for a closing ceremony. Volunteers handed out hot chocolate, children huddled with new coats provided by the foundation, and a sense of belonging wrapped the park like a second layer of warmth. Ethan stood on the stage with Isabella and Mia by his side. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, but for once, he didn't care about the optics. He cared only about telling the truth. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying through the speakers, steadier than he felt. "A year ago, I walked past a bus stop and saw a little girl asleep on a bench. I nearly kept walking, but something stopped me. That night changed my life, because that little girl wasn't just a stranger, she became my daughter." The crowd murmured, emotion rippling through them. Isabella squeezed his hand, her eyes shimmering with pride. Ethan continued, "I built empires, but they were empty. I gathered wealth, but it never gave me peace. It took a child with a ragged doll and a woman brave enough to challenge me, to show me what mattered. Today, I stand before you, not as a CEO, but as a husband, a father, and a man who finally understands that belonging is the greatest." Applause thundered through the park. Some wept openly, others simply nodded, as if Ethan's words had reached into their own unspoken wounds. Mia tugged his sleeve, and Ethan bent low. "Can I say something too?" she whispered. He smiled and handed her the microphone, his heart swelling as she stood on tiptoe to reach it. Her small voice rang out clear. "I used to live at a bus stop. I was scared and cold. But now, I have a home, and I want every kid to have one too." The silence that followed was broken by a wave of applause, louder than before. Reporters scribbled furiously, but Ethan didn't need their headlines. He knew the truth. Mia's words had already done more than any speech of his ever could. As the crowd dispersed, families lingering with newfound hope, Ethan stood with Isabella and Mia beneath the lanterns. For the first time in years, he felt no burden, no hollow ambition, just peace. Isabella leaned close, whispering, "You kept your promise, Ethan. You belong." He closed his eyes, letting the truth settle. For years, he had thought legacy was something etched in skyscrapers and stock tickers. But tonight, he understood. Legacy wasn't wealth, it was belonging. It was the memory of a bus stop transformed into the promise of a home. And as he held Isabella's hand in one and Mia's in the other, Ethan Cole knew he had finally found his